There is a particular quality of silence that belongs only to the Palouse in the early morning hours of May. A silence so complete and so specific to that corner of eastern Washington state that men who have lived within it for decades will tell you it has a sound all its own. It is the sound of 1,000 acres of winter wheat breathing in unison before the sun crests the low hills, of topsoil so dark and loamy it seems almost black against the pale sky, of a land so productive and so ancient in its rhythms that it tolerates the presence of human beings only because, over the course of several generations, certain families have learned to ask its permission before doing anything of consequence. Silas Garrett was one of those men who had learned to ask. He was 63 years old in the spring of 1980, though he could have passed for 70 on a hard day or 55 on a good one, depending on whether you caught him coming out of the barn after a difficult calving or sitting on the tailgate of his 62 Ford half-ton at the end of a day when everything had gone right. He stood 5 feet 10 in his work boots, the same Red Wing 8-inch lace-ups he had been wearing since sometime in the late 1950s, not the same pair of course, but always the same model, resold so many times at Harkin's Boot Repair in Colfax that old Walt Harkin once said he could close his eyes and rebuild one from memory. His hands were the hands of a man who had spent 40 years working soil. Thick through the palm, the knuckles enlarged by cold and repetition, the fingernails always carrying a thin crescent of earth that no amount of scrubbing at the kitchen sink ever fully removed. His face was the color of old saddle leather, creased around the eyes and mouth in the particular way that belongs to people who spend their lives squinting into a horizon. He didn't talk much. This was not unfriendliness. Anyone in the county would have told you that. Silas Garrett would give you the shirt off his back and the last gallon of diesel from his tank if you needed it. He would show up with his post-hole digger at 6 in the morning if your fence line went down in a storm, and he would refuse any payment other than a cup of coffee and the knowledge that the fence was right again. But he was not a man who spent words carelessly. Words, in his philosophy, were like good seed corn. You planted them only where they had a chance to grow into something. He had lost his wife, Ruth, in the winter of 1974. Pancreatic cancer. She was gone in 11 weeks from the first diagnosis, and when they buried her in the small cemetery behind the Lutheran church in Endicott, Silas had said exactly 2 sentences over the grave. She was a good woman, and she deserved better than this. He had gone home that evening, fed the livestock, eaten a can of soup cold from the tin because he'd forgotten to heat it, and been up before dawn the next morning to break the east field for spring planting. Grief, for Silas Garrett, was something you carried in your chest while you worked. You did not put it down and examine it. You worked. The farm itself was 460 acres on a series of rolling hills above the little creek called Soldier's Fork, which emptied eventually into the Palouse River. His grandfather, Emmett Garrett, had homesteaded the original 200 acres in 1904, having come out from Iowa with $20, a draft horse named Congressman, and a determination that his children would never be hungry. Emmett's son Harold, Silas's father, had bought the adjacent 260 acres during the Depression when the Halverson family, unable to service their debt, had accepted Harold's offer of $4,000 in cash, scraped together from years of careful saving and one good harvest in 1928. Harold had always spoken of that transaction with a mixture of gratitude and guilt that his son never fully understood as a boy, but came to understand completely as a man. In 1980, Silas ran wheat primarily, winter wheat, planted in September, harvested in July, along with a rotation of dry peas and lentils in alternating fields, and a small herd of 38 beef cattle that he kept partly for the income and partly because a farm without cattle, in his considered opinion, was only a farm in the technical sense. He had no hired men. He had not employed a full-time hand since his neighbor's boy, Dale Briggs, had gone off to Vietnam in 1968 and come back 2 years later changed in ways that made farm work difficult. He managed everything himself, with occasional help from his neighbor Earl Lundquist, who farmed 180 acres to the north and shared Silas's general philosophy about how a farm ought to be run, which was to say carefully, without debt, and with profound suspicion toward anything that arrived in a brochure. His machinery inventory would have made a modern agricultural consultant weep. His primary tractor was a 1962 International Farmall 560, which he had purchased used in 1968 and rebuilt twice since then. He owned a John Deere 420 from the late 50s that he used for lighter work around the property. He had a hay swather from 1971 that worked perfectly and that he saw no reason to replace. And there was the Farmall H. The Farmall H had belonged to his father. Harold Garrett had bought it new in the spring of 1947, driving it home from the International Harvester dealer in Pullman with the pride of a man receiving a medal, though he would never have described it that way. It was painted the deep, particular red that International Harvester called IH red in those days, a color somewhere between a fire engine and a dried rose. And it had a 4-cylinder engine that produced 24 horsepower on the drawbar and enough pulling force to handle anything a family farm in the Palouse was likely to ask of it. Harold Garrett had used it for 20 years as his primary tractor, until Silas brought home the 560 and the H was retired to the back corner of the main barn. But retired was not the same as discarded. Not on this farm. Not with this family. The 1970s had not been kind to small farmers in eastern Washington, though the hardship had arrived with the particular cruelty of something dressed up to look like opportunity. The decade had begun with commodity prices rising and the Secretary of Agriculture, Earl Butz, making the rounds of farm country with a message that became so famous and so consequential that men would still be arguing about it 20 years later. Plant fence row to fence row, he told them. Get big or get out. The world needed food, prices were good, and the time to expand was now. Banks were lending. The government was encouraging. The machinery dealers were offering terms that seemed, in the optimistic light of 1972 and 1973, to make perfect sense. Then came the grain embargo of 1975, and then the interest rates began to climb, and by the late 70s, the farmers who had borrowed heavily to buy more land and more equipment were looking at debt service that consumed every dollar of profit in a good year and everything else in a bad one. Interest rates by 1979 were approaching 15%, and whispers were already circulating through the county co-op and the grain elevator and the coffee counter at Marge's Diner in town that things were going to get worse before they got better. Silas had watched all of this with the detached attention of a man who had not participated in it. He carried no debt. He had never believed in debt, which was his father's religion and his grandfather's before that. When the 560 needed a new injection pump in 1975, he had put it on layaway at the implement dealer in Pullman and made payments for 8 months rather than finance it through the bank. When he needed a new grain auger in 1977, he had spent 3 weeks looking at used equipment from farms that were already beginning to sell off, and had found one for $400 that with a new bearing and a coat of paint worked as well as anything out of the dealer's showroom. He had not expanded. He had not borrowed. He had planted his 460 acres every year and harvested what they gave him and accepted, without complaint, that some years were better than others. His neighbors, on the whole, had not been so restrained. Tommy Briggs, Dale's younger brother, who had taken over his father's farm in 1971, had expanded from 300 acres to nearly 1,000, financing the land purchases and the new equipment through the Federal Land Bank and First National of Spokane. By 1979, Tommy was running 2 brand-new John Deere 4440 tractors, a new air seeder drill that had cost more than Silas's entire machinery inventory, and a combine that Tommy described as the most sophisticated piece of agricultural equipment in the county, and that Silas, when he had looked at it, had privately thought the most unnecessarily complicated. Tommy was not a bad man or a foolish one. He was a man of his times, which is to say a man who had been told, by people with impressive credentials and sincere faces, that the old ways of doing things were over, that science and technology had remade agriculture in the same way they had remade everything else, and that a farmer who did not adapt would be left behind. The days of the family farm were ending, these voices said, and the only question was whether you would ride the wave of modernization to prosperity or be swamped by it. The most confident carrier of this message in Whitman County, Washington, in the spring of 1980, was a man named Dale Whitmore. Dale Whitmore had arrived in the Palouse in the fall of 1978, driving a white Ford F-250 with the logo of Consolidated Agri-Northwest painted on the door in blue and green, and he had introduced himself around the county with the practiced ease of a man who had done a great deal of introducing himself. He was 41 years old, had a business degree from the University of Washington and an agricultural management certificate from Washington State. wore Wrangler jeans and a Western shirt in an effort to appear to belong to the community, and favored a pair of Tony Lama boots whose pristine condition suggested a relationship with mud that remained, to date, purely theoretical. Consolidated Agri-Northwest was one of a new breed of corporate farming operations that had been quietly accumulating land across the Pacific Northwest through the late 1970s. They were backed by a combination of pension fund money, a Seattle investment bank, and what Whitmore referred to, in the informational meetings he held at the Grange Hall and the County Extension Office, as modern agricultural science. They owned, by the spring of 1980, approximately 11,000 acres in Whitman County alone, spread across a dozen different parcels purchased from farmers who had borrowed too much and could no longer service the debt when interest rates climbed past 15%. Whitmore was, by any measurable standard, a capable and intelligent man. He understood commodity markets. He understood soil chemistry. He understood the tax advantages of large-scale corporate farming in a way that would have impressed most accountants. What he did not understand, what he had not grown up knowing in his bones the way the men around him had, was the land itself. He had never sat in a tractor cab at 4 a.m. watching the first light come up over the hills with the particular feeling that this land was yours and your father's and his father's before that. He had never smelled a field after a late April rain and known from the smell alone whether the soil temperature was right for drilling. He had never made a decision about tillage based on 40 years of watching what that specific hillside did in a wet spring versus a dry one. But Consolidated had equipment that made all of that seem beside the point. By May of 1980, Whitmore's operation ran a fleet of 5 tractors, all purchased in the previous 2 years, 3 John Deere 4440s and 2 International 1080 SXS, all equipped with climate-controlled cabs, electronic monitoring systems, and the latest in engine filtration technology. The air filtration systems on these machines were state-of-the-art, dual-element paper air cleaners with pre-cleaner cyclones that the manufacturer's brochure described, in language that Whitmore liked to quote at Grange meetings, as capable of filtering particles down to 5 microns in size. He had mentioned this fact specifically to Silas once, in March of 1980, at the Whitman County Extension Service's Spring Agricultural Outlook meeting, held in the basement of the Pullman Elks Lodge. Silas had been sitting near the back, as was his custom, with a cup of coffee that had gone cold without his noticing, listening to the extension agent talk about spring wheat varieties and fumonisin risk in the Corn Belt, and several other things that Silas was only partially interested in. Whitmore had stood up during the question period and mentioned that Consolidated's new filtration systems were capable of handling whatever conditions the Palouse spring might produce, which had led to a brief and not entirely cordial exchange with Earl Lundquist in the row ahead of Silas, who had said something under his breath about brochures and horse manure that had made Silas's mouth twitch slightly at the corner. Silas had not said anything at all. He rarely did at public meetings. He had driven home in his truck, done the evening chores, and sat for a while in the kitchen with a cup of coffee that he actually drank hot, looking out the window at the barn where the Farmall H sat in the back corner under its canvas tarp. He had thought about his father. He had thought about 1947, the year Harold Garrett had driven that red tractor home from Pullman and introduced it to every person on the farm, including the horses, as though it were a new member of the family. He had thought about the summer of 1952, when a dry spell had cracked the topsoil like old pottery, and the H had pulled the subsoiler through ground so hard it had cracked 2 other farmers' equipment that season, but had come through without complaint. He had thought about nothing in particular for a while. Then he had washed his cup, turned off the kitchen light, and gone to bed. The Farmall H was, by the spring of 1980, 33 years old, and it looked it. The original IH red paint had faded to a dusty coral in some places and chipped away entirely in others, revealing the gray primer beneath. The tin hood was dented along the right side from an incident in 1961 that Harold had never fully explained to his son. The right rear fender was a replacement, painted in a slightly different shade of red that had never quite matched the original, and the steel seat was mounted on a spring that had developed a peculiar squeak sometime around 1968 that no amount of lubrication had ever fully silenced. But every mechanical component of that tractor was sound. This was not an accident or a coincidence. Silas Garrett had maintained the Farmall H the way his father had before him, carefully, consistently, and with the understanding that a machine well-tended will outlast its critics by decades. The engine had been rebuilt once, in 1971, by Silas himself, working alone in the barn over 3 weeks in January when there was nothing else to do, and the repair gave him something to think about besides the emptiness of the house since Ruth's first illness. The valves were seated correctly. The main bearings were within specification. The magneto sparked reliably. The carburetor had been rebuilt twice with kits that Silas had ordered from a specialty supplier in Iowa, who still stocked parts for engines that the mainstream dealers had long since stopped supporting. And then there was the air cleaner. The air filtration system on the 1947 Farmall H was a technology that had been considered state-of-the-art in the years immediately following the Second World War, and that had been largely replaced, through the 1950s and 1960s, by paper element filter systems that offered better filtration numbers in laboratory conditions and were cheaper to maintain in the sense that you simply replaced the paper element rather than cleaning and re-oiling a metal assembly. Most tractors built after 1960 used paper elements. By 1980, paper elements were universal on new equipment, and the men who designed and sold that equipment genuinely believed, in good faith, that they had improved upon the older technology in every meaningful way. The oil bath air cleaner worked on a principle of almost beautiful simplicity. Air entered through a pre-cleaner cap at the top and was drawn down through a tube into a metal bowl at the bottom that contained a reservoir of oil, typically crankcase oil, the dark used stuff that came out when you did an oil change. The incoming air struck the surface of this oil at speed, and the larger particles of dust and debris were captured by the oil's viscosity and sank to the bottom of the bowl. The air then reversed direction, traveling upward through a wire mesh element that had been soaked in the same oil, and any remaining fine particles were caught in the mesh before the cleaned air continued on to the carburetor. It was not, by laboratory measurement, as efficient as a good paper element at filtering the very finest particles under ideal conditions. In the conditions for which both systems were designed, normal field dust, chaff, general agricultural particulate, the difference was largely academic. Both systems worked. Both kept enough dirt out of the engine to allow it to do its job for a normal service life. But the oil bath air cleaner had one characteristic that the paper element did not. When it was exposed to an extraordinary volume of fine, dense, abrasive particulate, the kind of challenge far beyond what any normal laboratory test anticipated, it did not clog. The oil simply accumulated more particles, and when the bowl was full, you drained it, cleaned it, refilled it with fresh oil, and kept going. The paper element, by contrast, was a finite filter. Load it with enough fine material quickly enough, and it became impermeable, cutting off airflow to the engine entirely, at which point the engine either stalled or, if it was run hard in that condition, destroyed itself as unfiltered air bypassed the clogged element. Silas understood all of this. He understood it not as a theoretical proposition, but as a practical reality grounded in decades of observation. He had watched paper element equipment struggle in the field during dusty harvests when his H ran all day without complaint. He had heard other farmers complain about clogged filters during particularly bad wind years, and had privately attributed their difficulty to the very modernity they were so proud of. He had not said this out loud. It was not his style to instruct people who had not asked to be instructed. The H sat under its canvas tarp in the back corner of the barn. Silas checked it every spring, ran the engine for half an hour, checked the oil, checked the coolant, greased the fittings, not because he expected to need it that particular year, but because a tool not maintained was a tool lost, and his father had taught him never to lose a tool if he could help it. In the spring of 1980, he had done his maintenance check in early April. The engine started on the third crank, ran rough for 30 seconds, then smoothed out to the particular steady thump-thump-thump of a well-maintained four-cylinder that some men, Silas among them, found more satisfying than any other sound in the world. He had let it run, checked the oil level, noted that the oil in the bath of the air cleaner had thickened somewhat over the winter and should be changed before real work was done, and made a mental note to pick up a quart of used crankcase oil from his drain pan for the purpose. He had not yet gotten around to it when the mountain began to make itself known. Mount St. Helens had been rumbling since March. Everyone in the Pacific Northwest knew about it. It had been on the television news every night. The local Spokane stations, Walter Cronkite on CBS, Even the radio news that played on the AM station out of Pullman that Silas listened to in the tractor cab. There had been small eruptions, earthquakes, a bulge developing on the north face of the mountain that geologists were watching with what they described, on television, in the particular careful language of scientists who know something alarming is coming but cannot say exactly when. There were aerial photographs of steam venting from the summit and of the swelling north flank, which had pushed out laterally by something close to 400 feet. People took it seriously, but at a slight distance, the way you take seriously a story happening in another county. Mount St. Helens was in southwestern Washington, near the Oregon border, a long way from the wheat fields of the Palouse. The geologists were saying that even in the event of a significant eruption, the main hazards would be localized, pyroclastic flows, lahars, timber blowdown in the immediate vicinity. There might be ash, they allowed. There would certainly be some ashfall downwind. But eastern Washington was nearly 300 miles from the mountain. Most people, without really articulating it, assumed that 300 miles was enough. On the morning of Sunday, May 18, 1980, Silas was doing what he did most Sunday mornings in late spring. He had been up since 5:30, had done the feeding and the basic barn chores, had come in and made himself breakfast, 2 eggs, toast, coffee, and was standing at the kitchen window with his second cup when the phone rang. It was Earl Lundquist. "Turn on the television," Earl said. Silas did not own a television that could be called functional in any modern sense. He had a black and white set from 1968 that received 3 channels on a good day through the antenna on the roof, and it took several minutes to warm up properly. He turned it on, waited for the picture to solidify, and watched Walter Cronkite substitute, whoever was on the Sunday morning news desk, describe, with visible excitement imperfectly concealed by professional composure, what had happened at 8:32 that morning. The north face of Mount St. Helens had collapsed. The largest landslide in recorded American history had removed the upper portion of the mountain in seconds, and the eruption that followed had sent a column of ash and gas and pulverized rock 54,000 feet into the stratosphere. The lateral blast had been heard in 3 states. People had died. A geologist named David Johnston, who had been monitoring the mountain from a ridge 5 miles away, a cantankerous 83-year-old named Harry Truman, who had refused to evacuate his lodge on Spirit Lake, and eventually 57 people in total, though the full count would take days to establish. Silas watched for 20 minutes, then turned the television off, sat down at the kitchen table, and thought about the mountain. He thought about the ash column. He thought about which way the wind was blowing. He had been a student of weather his entire adult life, as every farmer must be, and he knew that in the Pacific Northwest in May, the upper-level winds generally ran from west to east, sometimes angling to the northeast. He thought about the Palouse. He thought about his fields, which had been drilled in late September of 1979 with winter wheat that was now at the stage his father had called flag leaf, the final leaf emerging before heading, one of the most critical periods in the plant's development. He thought about dust storms he had seen in his years on the land. He thought about a particular dust storm in August of 1961 that had come out of the west and covered everything in a fine brown powder for 3 days, and what that had done to machinery that wasn't careful. He thought about the composition of volcanic ash, something about silica and glass particles, from a high school earth science class whose details had grown hazy in the 45 years since, but the basic fact of it remained. He got up, went to the barn, and pulled the canvas tarp off the Farmall H. The ash reached the Palouse region on the afternoon of May 18th, beginning as a darkening on the western horizon that most people initially mistook for storm clouds. By evening it was clear that it was not clouds. The sky to the west had turned a color that had no precedent in anyone's experience. A brownish-gray, yellowish-gray, the color of concrete mixed with old dishwater, advancing steadily and blotting out the sun with the methodical patience of a curtain being drawn across a window. By nightfall, the first ash was falling on Colfax, on Pullman, on the farms and towns and roads of Whitman County. It fell silently, with none of the drama of rain or snow, settling over everything with a fine, dry finality. By the following morning, May 19th, the landscape had been transformed into something from another world. Every surface, the fields, the roads, the rooftops, the parked vehicles, the fence posts and power lines, was covered in a layer of pale gray ash 2 to 3 inches deep in some areas, drifted in places where the light wind had pushed it against fences and buildings into small gray dunes. Silas had been up through the night, not sleeping but not anxious either, sitting in the kitchen and listening to the radio. The Spokane AM station was running continuous coverage, and between the news reports came the first warnings from agricultural engineers and machinery dealers and extension agents. Do not, under any circumstances, start your tractor or truck or any internal combustion engine until the ash situation has been assessed. The ash, one engineer explained in a voice that carried the particular gravity of a man delivering news he knows will be badly received, contains fine particles of silica, essentially ground glass, that will act as an abrasive in any engine. The paper element air filters on modern equipment will clog almost immediately. If the engine continues to run with a clogged filter, unfiltered ash will enter the combustion chamber and destroy the engine within minutes. The advice was stark and absolute. Park everything and wait. Silas listened to this. He went to the barn. He looked at the ash that had sifted in under the barn door and lay in a thin gray film over everything. Over the concrete floor, over the fenders of his tractors, over the canvas tarp he had pulled off the Farmall H. He picked up a pinch of the ash between his fingers and rubbed it together. It was fine. Finer than the finest road dust he had ever worked in, finer than the flour dust in a grain elevator. It was abrasive between his fingers. You could feel the silica content in the way it moved, with a microscopic grittiness that was almost imperceptible but was definitely there. He rubbed his fingers together for a long time, thinking about what this material would do inside an engine, how it would sit in the oil film on a cylinder wall and score it slowly and irreversibly, how it would work its way into bearings and do the same, how the damage would be invisible at first and absolute by the end. He looked at the Farmall H. He had always kept a 2-gallon drain pan under the workbench, catching the used oil from oil changes, his own tractors and his truck, and sometimes Earl's equipment when Earl brought it over for one service or another. The pan was about 3/4 full of dark, used 30-weight motor oil, thick and almost black, the accumulated drainage of maybe 6 oil changes over the previous year. He looked at the drain pan. He looked at the H. He looked at the metal bowl of the oil bath air cleaner, which sat beneath the hood just behind the air intake stack. He thought about it for a good 5 minutes, which was, for Silas Garrett, a lengthy deliberation. Then he picked up the drain pan and walked over to the tractor. While Silas was thinking in his barn, the situation in Whitman County was developing with the speed and confusion that always accompanies a disaster that falls outside the range of anyone's prior experience. Dale Whitmore had been on the phone since 6 in the morning. He had called his equipment dealers, his company's regional manager in Yakima, and an agricultural engineer at Washington State University who had answered the phone and then expressed, with considerable urgency, the same warning that had been on the radio all night. Do not start the equipment. The paper filters will fail. The ash is essentially ground glass. You will destroy your engines. Whitmore had relayed this to his company's management, who had relayed it upward, and by mid-morning of May 19th, a decision had been communicated back down the chain. Consolidated Agri-Northwest would park all equipment and await further instruction. They would petition the county for a planting deadline extension. They would consult with their insurers about coverage for ash damage and crop loss. The problem with this decision was apparent to anyone who knew agriculture, and particularly to anyone who understood the specific rhythms of Palouse wheat farming. The winter wheat already in the ground was not their immediate problem, but Consolidated had not yet planted their spring barley fields, some 1,200 acres of them, and the planting window for spring barley in the Palouse was not a generous thing. You had, roughly, from late April to mid-May. The ash had fallen on the 19th. Every day without planting was a day subtracted from the growing season and, ultimately, from the yield. Whitmore drove out to his equipment yard on the morning of the 19th and looked at his tractors. They sat under their coating of ash, looking expensive and very, very still. He had been told not to start them. He had been told that the ash would destroy the engines. He had been told by people with engineering degrees and by the equipment manufacturers themselves that the current filter technology was not designed for this kind of particulate load. He stood in the ash. It came up over his boot soles, and the Tony llamas that had never quite touched mud were now covered to the ankle in gray. And he looked at 5 tractors worth collectively somewhere north of $200,000, and he thought about 1,200 unplanted acres, and he reached for the phone in his truck. By noon on the 19th, 2 of his 5 tractors had been started. Whitmore had consulted with his regional manager, who had consulted with an equipment specialist, who had suggested that perhaps if they ran the tractors slowly and checked the filters frequently, they might be able to get some planting done before the ash situation was resolved. The first tractor, a John Deere 4440 with 1,400 hours on it, nearly new by any standard, had started without difficulty and had run for approximately 40 minutes before the operator noticed that the engine temperature was rising and the power was dropping. He shut it down. When the air filter housing was opened, the paper element was packed solid with gray ash, dense as felt, allowing essentially no airflow. That was the tractor they would later consider the lucky one. The second tractor had been run by an operator who either had not understood the warning or had underestimated its urgency. He had noticed the power dropping and had pushed the throttle harder to compensate, which was precisely the wrong response. When insufficient air reaches a diesel engine and the operator increases fuel delivery, the mixture goes rich, temperatures rise, and the engine begins to run in a condition it was never designed to handle. The operator of Consolidated's second 4440 ran his tractor for nearly an hour before it ceased. The sound, one of the nearby men later described, was like something inside the engine trying to fight its way out. A stuttering, grinding surge followed by a bang that they felt as much as heard, and then silence. The engine was destroyed. Replacement cost, if the block could be saved, somewhere around $30,000. If it couldn't, the tractor itself was a near total loss. By the afternoon of the 19th, word had traveled the county with the speed that only bad news achieves in a small agricultural community. Tommy Briggs had tried his older John Deere 4240 and had managed to get it shut down before complete destruction, but the engine would need a full rebuild. 2 other operations had similar stories. The County Extension Service, by mid-afternoon, was fielding calls from farmers who had already done damage and farmers who desperately wanted to find a way around the warning but were afraid of what it would cost them. By 4 in the afternoon of May 19, 1980, the consensus in Whitman County, Washington, was grim and official. There was no way to run internal combustion machinery in the ash until it had been cleared, and clearing it would take days at minimum, possibly longer. The spring planting season was, for practical purposes, suspended. This was the situation when Silas Garrett's nearest neighbor, a retired schoolteacher named Florence Gaskill who lived a quarter mile up the county road, called her daughter in Spokane and mentioned that she could hear, through the window, the sound of a tractor running from the direction of the Garrett farm. Silas had checked the oil level in the Farmall H's bath that morning and found it about 2/3 full. He had topped it to the correct level. There was a mark on the side of the bowl indicating proper fill, with the used 30 weight from his drain pan, which had the right consistency, thick enough to trap particles, thin enough to allow the wire mesh element above it to function correctly. He checked the bowl's cleanliness, drained it, rinsed it with a small amount of fresh diesel fuel to clear the accumulated sediment from the winter storage, then refilled it with the used oil. He replaced the bowl, tightened the wing nut, and fitted the wire mesh element back in place. He put on his coat, the old Carhartt duck canvas that had been patched 4 times and that Ruth had once described as the ugliest garment on earth and also the most useful, and his hat, a felt-brimmed thing with no particular style that he had bought at a hardware store in 1963. He went to the kitchen and came back with a damp rag that he tied around the lower part of his face, from the nose down, with the simplicity of a man who has learned that when fine dust is your adversary, keeping it out of your own lungs is at least as important as keeping it out of the engine. He climbed onto the H. The steel seat squeaked on its spring as it always did. He pulled the choke, set the throttle, and pressed the starter. The engine turned over twice, fired, coughed, and settled into its rhythm. The sound of it in that silent, ash-muffled morning was extraordinary. The particular 4-cylinder heartbeat of the old engine, unhurried, deliberate, deeply mechanical in a way that the newer diesel engines with their smoother, faster beats were somehow not, carried across the yard and the empty fields with perfect clarity. Silas sat on the H for 3 minutes, letting the engine warm up fully, watching the temperature gauge climb to its normal operating position, listening for any sound that suggested something was wrong. There was nothing wrong. He put it in gear and drove out of the barn. The field that needed the most immediate attention was the East 40. The lower field a long soldier's fork that he had kept in fallow the previous year and had planned to drill to spring wheat that week. He had the disc ready on the drawbar of the H in a configuration that had pulled this disc many times in its earlier life. His father's hands had made this same connection on this same machine 30 years before. He pulled out of the barnyard and onto the ash-covered lane. The Farmall H moved through the gray landscape like something from a different time, which was precisely what it was. The ash came up around the front wheels in small gray clouds as the tires broke the surface, settled back as they passed, left two dark tracks behind him. The sky was still overcast with ash haze, reducing the light to a flat, shadowless gray that made the landscape look two-dimensional, like an old photograph of itself. The trees along the fence lines were gray. The fence posts were gray. The roofline of his barn, receding behind him, was gray. And moving through all of that gray, throwing up its small red bow wave of dust and purpose, came the H. Silas shifted to working gear, lowered the disc into the soil, and began to work. The disc broke through the ash layer and turned the dark Palouse topsoil up behind it, and the contrast was violent and beautiful. The gray ash folded under, and the black earth rolled up in a wave that steamed slightly in the cool morning air, and where the disc had passed the field was black again, remade, ready. He worked in careful, methodical rows, turning at the end of each pass, making the tractor and disc do what they were designed to do, which was to turn soil and prepare it for seed. He worked the way his father had worked and his grandfather before that, with full attention and no wasted motion, the tractor and the man together reading the ground as they went. He checked the oil bath on the air cleaner at the end of his second hour. The bowl was darkening with accumulated ash. The oil had done its job, capturing the fine silica particles before they could reach the engine. He drained the bowl, rinsed it quickly with a splash of diesel, refilled it from his supply can of used oil, and went back to work. He would check it again in another hour. The maintenance was simple and required nothing more than the willingness to stop and do it. He was not aware, as he began his third hour in the field, that anyone else could see him. Earl Lundquist saw him first, from the cab of his own truck parked at the top of the hill where the county road crested before dropping toward Soldier's Fork. Earl had driven up there out of a habit that stretched back decades. When he was uncertain about the weather or the state of the world, he drove to the top of that hill and looked at the surrounding country, because something about the perspective helped him think. He had been listening to the radio and looking at his own parked tractor and wondering what he was going to do about the 200 acres of spring barley that needed to go in the ground, and he had driven to the top of the hill to think about it. What he saw through the gray haze of the ash-hung air was a small red tractor working its way up the eastern slope of Silas Garrett's lower field, turning up black earth behind it in a strip as straight as a ruled line. Earl sat in his truck for a long time, watching. Then he got on the CB radio. Earl's call went to his son, who relayed it to his neighbor, who mentioned it at the grain elevator in town, where a small group of farmers had gathered to share misery and listen to the radio. By early afternoon of May 19th, Silas Garrett's field had become, without his knowledge or intention, a point of reference for the entire county. Tommy Briggs drove out to the Garrett farm at around 2 in the afternoon. He parked his truck on the county road and watched Silas work for a while without getting out. His face, visible through the windshield, was complicated. There was something in it that might have been admiration and something that might have been the particular kind of pain that comes from watching a thing work that you had not understood and had perhaps, at some point, been dismissive of. Tommy had never said anything unkind about Silas to his face, but he had been present at a Grange meeting in 1976 when someone had made a joke about old men with old iron who hadn't figured out what decade they were living in, and Tommy had laughed. He remembered that now. Dale Whitmore arrived at 4:30 in the white F-250 with the Consolidated logo. He parked behind Tommy's truck and got out and stood in the ash, his ruined boots gray to the ankle, and watched the Farmall H work. His face revealed nothing of what he was thinking, which was a skill that business school had refined in him and that he found, in this moment, was not entirely the asset he usually considered it. There are moments in a man's life when the correct response is to let your face show what you're feeling, and this was one of them. "What is that?" he asked Tommy Briggs, who was standing a few feet away. 1947 Farmall H, Tommy said. Silas Garrett's dad bought it new. "Why is it running when nobody else's equipment can run?" Tommy was quiet for a moment. "Oil bath air cleaner," he said. Traps the ash in the oil. Doesn't clog up like the paper filters. Whitmore looked at the tractor. He looked at his own parked fleet, somewhere beyond the horizon to the north, sitting under their coating of ash. He thought about $30,000 for an engine rebuild and 1,200 acres of unplanted barley. Can we get one? He asked. Or retrofit. They haven't made them standard on new equipment for 20 years, Tommy said. You'd have to find an old one. Or an old tractor that had one built in. Whitmore stood there. There was nothing to say about the irony of the situation that hadn't already been made plain by the sight of the old red tractor moving across the gray field with its deliberate, unhurried patience. Whitmore had come to this county 2 years ago carrying the conviction, sincere, evidence-based in its way, completely representative of the thinking of his time and his training, that modern technology had improved upon the old ways in every important respect. He had not been wrong about most things. His soil chemistry data was accurate. His commodity market analysis was sound. His equipment was, under normal conditions, genuinely superior in efficiency and output. But the old man with the old tractor was planting, and he was not. He got back in his truck and drove away without saying anything else. Silas worked until the light failed on the evening of May 19th, then drove the H back to the barn, cleaned the oil bath. It had required draining twice more during the afternoon as the ash load built up, and checked the engine over carefully. Oil pressure was good. Coolant temperature was normal. The engine showed no sign of distress. He fed the livestock, ate supper, listened to the radio for an hour, and went to bed. He was up before 5 the next morning. The county road, when he drove down it that morning to check on a fence line, had 2 inches of ash on it in the low spots, and was clearly impassable for any vehicle without clearance. The radio was saying that Highway 26 between Colfax and Pullman was being cautiously cleared by county road crews in masks, but that secondary roads might take days. He was, effectively, on his own island of working land in a county that had otherwise gone still. This was not, for Silas Garrett, a distressing condition. He had lived through an ice storm in 1969 that had cut the farm off from the road for 9 days. And he had managed. He kept a 6-month supply of canned goods and staples in the root cellar below the house, a habit inherited from his mother, who had been raised on stories of her own mother's experiences during the blizzards of the 1880s. He had fuel for the H and for his truck. He had work to do, and work was the one resource he had never lacked. Over the following 4 days, he worked approximately 12 hours each day, taking breaks to service the oil bath at regular intervals, and to do the necessary barn chores morning and evening. He disked and then prepared a seedbed on the East 40, then moved his drill to the H and planted it in 2 days of sustained work that left him tired in the bones, but satisfied in the way that planting always made him satisfied, the satisfaction of a man who has put something into the earth in the faith that it will come back to him. He started on the North 40 on the 4th day. On the 2nd day, Earl Lundquist appeared at the farm in his old International 574, which Silas was mildly surprised to see running until Earl explained, with the sheepish pride of a man confessing to something he was glad of, that he had found an old oil bath cleaner in his parts shed that had come off a tractor he'd traded away in 1971, and that his son had spent the morning adapting to fit the 574's air intake, with a combination of fabricated pipe fittings and what Earl described as a certain amount of creative profanity. The fit was not perfect and would need to be properly engineered at some point, but it was functional, and the 574 was running. Earl and Silas worked side by side on Silas's fields for 3 days, and then moved to Earl's fields for another 2 after that. And when the county roads were finally clear enough for careful traffic on May 24th, both men had their spring planting substantially complete. They stopped at noon on the 24th and ate lunch together on the tailgate of Earl's truck. Sandwiches that Earl's wife Eleanor had packed, coffee in a thermos, a piece of something that Eleanor called cake, and that Silas, eating it, privately thought was probably the best thing he had eaten in a week. The sky was still hazy with ash residue, but the ash had stopped falling, and there was a strip of genuine blue visible to the east, the first pure blue sky in 6 days. You knew, Earl said. It was not quite an accusation and not quite a compliment. It was an observation. Didn't know, Silas said. Figured it was possible. When did you figure that? Silas thought about it. Long time ago, he said. Earl drank his coffee. Whitmore's people are trying to find used equipment, he said. Old tractors with oil bath cleaners. I heard they're calling dealers in Idaho, Montana, clear down to Oregon. Silas nodded. Tommy Briggs is talking about getting his dad's old 400 out of storage. Says it's got an oil bath system. Silas nodded again. There was a comfortable silence between them of the kind that only forms between two men who have known each other for 30 years and have done a long, hard job together successfully. Ash had turned their faces the same gray color, and their clothes were gray, and the trucks were gray, but the field behind them was black and furrowed and seeded, and that was the correct condition of a field in May, and it was a good thing to sit and look at. Your dad's tractor, Earl said after a while. Yeah, he'd have liked that. Silas looked at the H, parked at the edge of the field, sitting in a thin coating of ash the color of old snow. The red showed through in places, at the hood, along the fenders, on the big rear wheels where the lugs had scraped the ash off against the soil. It looked, at that distance, very much the way it had looked in 1947. It looked like itself. He would, Silas said. The full accounting of the 1980 Mount St. Helens ash event on agriculture in eastern Washington took months to assemble. Extension agents, university researchers, insurance adjusters, and machinery dealers all contributed to a picture that was, in its way, a kind of report card on the state of farming in the region, on its assumptions and its vulnerabilities, and the places where confidence in modernity had outrun the evidence for that confidence. The equipment losses across Whitman County were significant. By the best estimates available, dozens of farm engines had been damaged or destroyed in the critical days immediately following the eruption, most of them on operations that had tried to work through the ash warning, either from desperation or from a miscalculation of how fast the paper elements would fail. Total repair and replacement costs across the county ran into the millions of dollars. Several operations that had already been financially stressed by the combination of high debt loads and high interest rates found that the equipment losses were the final weight that broke the back of their balance sheets. And there were farm sales in Whitman County in the summer and fall of 1980 that would not have happened otherwise. Dale Whitmore's Consolidated Agri-Northwest operation eventually got through the ash event. They brought in rental equipment from eastern Idaho that had been fitted with improvised protective covers over the air intakes. They located 2 used tractors with oil bath systems through calls to dealers across 3 states, and they hired a contractor who managed to get roughly half their spring barley in the ground, albeit late and at extraordinary cost. The company's regional manager flew up from Yakima, had several pointed conversations with Whitmore about the destroyed engine and the overall cost of the event, and left with the clear implication that Whitmore's position might need to be reevaluated. Whitmore kept his job, as it turned out, but the easy confidence he had carried into Whitman County in 1978 was somewhat diminished. He was seen less often at Grange meetings after that, and when he was there, he talked less and listened more, which was an improvement on both counts. The agricultural engineers at Washington State University, to their credit, conducted a thorough post-event analysis and published a bulletin the following spring that discussed, among other things, the relative performance of oil bath and paper element air filtration systems under extreme particulate conditions. The bulletin was careful and qualified in its language. Academic papers are always careful and qualified in their language, but its practical conclusion was plain enough. In high particulate conditions outside the normal design parameters of paper filter systems, oil bath filtration provided a significant operational advantage. Several tractor manufacturers, the bulletin noted, had been reconsidering the abandonment of oil bath systems for certain heavy-duty applications. Silas did not read the bulletin. He was busy farming. He had planted his spring wheat on time. The winter wheat, undisturbed in the ground through the ash event, came through the spring without notable damage and headed out well in June. The ash, as it weathered and was worked into the soil, contributed a fine mineral component to the Palouse topsoil that several agronomists would later describe as beneficial. There was something almost ironic about this, the destructive event leaving behind an increment of fertility that would compound quietly in the soil for years. The 1980 harvest on the Garrett farm was not spectacular, but it was adequate. It was, in the language of the farm, a year they got through. Tommy Briggs had his father's International 400 running by the 5th day of the ash event and managed to get most of his spring crop in, though late. His debt situation remained dire, and he would eventually sell the new equipment in 1982. both the 4440s and the air seeder drill, at a painful loss as interest rates reached their peak, and the early stages of what would come to be called the farm crisis began to announce themselves across the Midwest and Pacific Northwest. He kept his father's 400, though. He put a new set of tires on it and kept it in the equipment shed, and when his own children were old enough to ask about it, he told them the story of the ash and the oil bath air cleaner and the old man on the red tractor with some care and some emphasis, wanting them to understand something about the difference between what a thing costs and what a thing is worth. It was not a lesson that could be learned from a brochure. Earl Lundquist went home after the planting was done and wrote a letter to his son that he never sent. His son was grown and farming his own land in Idaho. And what would the letter have said that the son didn't already know? But he wrote it anyway, sitting at the kitchen table with Eleanor's good coffee and the May evening coming in through the window. And he wrote about working alongside Silas in the ash, and about the H, and about what his own father had taught him, and he felt, writing it, that he was setting something down for safekeeping. He put it in the Bible on the shelf next to the kitchen table, between the family history pages in the front and the concordance in the back, and it stayed there for 20 years until Eleanor found it after Earl died, and gave it to their son at the funeral, who read it and wept in the particular way that men of that generation wept, privately, briefly, not looking at anyone else, then composed himself and went out to check on the cattle because the cattle needed checking, and that was what you did. Silas kept the Farmall H under its canvas tarp in the back corner of the barn for another 14 years, until 1994, when his hip began giving him serious trouble, and he made the reluctant acknowledgement that there were things he could no longer do alone. He sold the farm, not to a corporate operation, though he had offers, but to a young family from Garfield who were, in his assessment, the kind of people the land deserved. He sold the 560 and the 420 and the haying equipment with the farm, because that was how it ought to be, the working equipment going with the working land. He did not sell the Farmall H. He had it cleaned up and trucked to his daughter's place in Colfax, where it sat for a while in her husband's shop, and then, after some consideration, Silas had it restored. Not restored in the sense of made to look new and perfect. He had seen that kind of restoration at farm shows and found something slightly dishonest about it, like putting a suit on a working man and pretending he'd always worn one. He had it restored in the sense of made completely right. The engine freshened, the brakes adjusted, the electrical system rewired where the wiring had gotten fragile with age, the paint matched and applied carefully to the original contours. The dent in the hood he left, because the dent in the hood was part of what the machine was. The spring on the seat still squeaked. He had a small plaque made at a trophy shop in Colfax, a modest thing, brushed aluminum with black lettering, about the size of a business card. He fastened it to the instrument panel with 2 small screws. The plaque read, 1947 International Farmall H. Harold F. Garrett, 1947. Silas W. Garrett, 1980. Soldiers Fork Farm, Whitman County, Washington. When everything else stopped, this did not. He took the H to the county fair in 1995 and won a blue ribbon in the antique tractor class, which he had not particularly been trying to win and which surprised him somewhat. He drove the H in the Colfax 4th of July parade in 1997, sitting on the old squeaking spring seat with the same felt hat he'd worn since 1963, and a fair number of the older people in the crowd, the ones who were his age or older, who had grown up on farms or had spent their working lives on them, turned to watch it pass with an expression that was not quite a smile and not quite something sadder than a smile, but was somewhere in between. There is a photograph from that parade, taken by a woman from the Whitman County Gazette who had been covering the event, that shows Silas on the H with the crowd visible behind him, and it is an unusual photograph in the way that some photographs achieve the quality of summarizing something larger than themselves. He is looking straight ahead, as he always did. His hat is pulled down against the July sun. His hands are on the wheel. Those large, creased hands with the permanent shadow of earth in the knuckles, in the relaxed, familiar grip of a man who has been holding this wheel, in one form or another, his entire life. The tractor is moving through the sunlight, and all around it the crowd is watching, and on the faces of the older ones, the ones who remember, there is that expression that is between a smile and something sadder, the expression of people who recognize a thing they had forgotten they knew. Silas was not performing for them. He was simply driving the tractor, the way his father had taught him, the way he would have driven it anywhere. But the watching was appropriate, and he did not mind it. The Palouse is still there. The hills roll the same way they have always rolled, shaped by the same winds that built them over 10,000 years out of loess. The deep, incomparable Palouse loess that is one of the most productive soils on Earth, and that rewards careful stewardship with a generosity that is easy to take for granted until you see what happens when it isn't cared for. The farms on those hills are different now in some ways. Larger, mostly, more consolidated, more technological in their approach, and the same in others. The wheat still goes in September and comes out in July. The dry peas and lentils still rotate through. The soil still smells, after a spring rain, the way it has always smelled, of deep thyme and cold water, and the particular organic richness of land that has been farmed well and loved for a long time. Silas Garrett died in March of 2003, in his sleep, at the age of 86, in the bedroom of his daughter's house in Colfax. He had been declining for about 2 years, though declining was a word he had resisted as long as possible, continuing to do garden work and small mechanical tasks until the previous autumn, when his hands had finally begun to fail him in ways he couldn't work around. He did not leave much money. He had never had much money in the sense that money is usually counted. He left the H to his grandson, a 24-year-old named Jacob who had grown up hearing the story of the ash and who was, by some combination of blood and deliberate choice, a farmer. Jacob farms Soldier's Fork today, bought it back from the family that had purchased it in 1994 because that was where his roots went down, and he knew it. He uses modern equipment because he is not a man who confuses nostalgia for wisdom, which is perhaps the most useful lesson the old stories teach. He uses GPS guidance and precision seeding and yield monitoring systems on his combine. He reads the university extension bulletins and attends the agronomist meetings and is not dismissive of any tool that does its job well. But he keeps the Farmall H in the barn where it has always been. He starts it every spring. This is not sentiment alone, though it is that too. It is the acknowledgement of a practical fact. You do not know what you might need until you need it. And the things that were built to last and have been maintained to last are available to you in ways that the things built to be replaced are not. The oil bath is freshened every spring with the same dark used crankcase oil that has always done the job. The engine fires on the second or third crank and settles into its 4-cylinder rhythm, thump, 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 that is unlike any other sound in the world if you grew up hearing it. On a shelf in the barn, above the workbench where 3 generations of Garrett men have done their thinking while their hands were busy, there is a coffee can that dates, from the look of the label design, from sometime in the 1970s. Inside the can are the accumulated small odds and ends that any working shop accumulates over decades. A few bolts of various sizes, a spare magneto point set still in its wrapper, 2 wire connectors, a broken handle from a socket wrench, and a small glass vial, sealed with a cork, that contains a teaspoon or so of gray powder. The powder is ash, volcanic ash, from May 1980, from the morning Silas Garrett walked out to the East 40 and began to turn the gray world back to black. Jacob doesn't know who put it there or exactly when. He assumes it was his grandfather. He has not moved it. Some things should stay where someone decided to put them, in the place where they mean what they were intended to mean, doing the quiet work of memory in the dark of a shelf in a barn where the old red tractor waits. The Farmall H is red. Not brilliant red, not showroom red, but the faded, particular red of a thing that has been in the weather for a long time and come through it. In the gray-ash light of a Pacific Northwest morning in 1980, that red was the most vivid color in the world, the color of a thing that persisted when everything around it had stopped, of an old man's faith in his father's knowledge, of the simple and irreducible truth that the best tool for the job is not always the newest one, but sometimes the one that was built right in the first place and never thrown away. It is still that color. It will be that color for a long time yet. Some things were built to last, and some men knew to keep them.